Hi, everyone. So today I thought I'd continue my Jungian Type Explained Correctly series, and I'm just going to um, persevere in the four Jungian dichotomies. Before I covered extrovert versus introvert, sensing versus intuiting. Now I'm going to talk about thinking versus feeling, and specifically what makes a thinker type as opposed to a feeler type. Now, I would say whereas sensing and intuition is something which is not so terribly defined by regular Myers-Briggs type indicator people. I think quite a mistake has been made regarding thinking and feeling. So I'm going to go into that in a bit more depth. But first, let me tell you what I would say thinking and feeling is really about. So, to be a thinking type, you need to be someone for whom both thinking elements, so that's extroverted thinking and introverted thinking, are strong, which means that if you are placed into any new unfamiliar situation that requires the use of thinking, in other words, detached, impersonal information, or rather judgments to be made. So, in other words, analyzing what is logically correct, what is most efficient, taking in and picking out the most relevant factual data to apply to a situation, anything in that nature. Right? To be a thinker, you need to be someone who is going to be able to quite quickly get to grips with that in an unfamiliar setting. Whereas if you are a if you are instead having to deal with feeling information. So this is information, it is judgments, but it is personal, it is subjective, it's something that you feel, right? And you're in an unfamiliar situation in regards to having to grapple with feeling information that you would likely feel out of your depth. You'd likely feel that this situation is so unfamiliar to you, you don't know really what to do. It will take quite a while for you to get to grips with it. You may have to make a few mistakes and take a while to process and learn from this to build enough of a zone of familiarity in which you can now utilize this feeling information. So, fitting into a new crowd, you could say, finding the right way of pitching your conversation to this new audience, um, tackling a very sort of personal question about emotions or experiences you are not used to feeling and conveying that in a very sort of sincere and relatable way. Identifying from a completely new type of person whether you feel right about that person or not, and how close you want to be to them. How confident are you in making that assessment of their character? These kinds of very personal, subjective values. You would find that a thinker, they would struggle in if it is unfamiliar to them. And this is again the point, unfamiliarity, because it's too simplistic to say that feelers can't do thinking and thinkers can't do feeling. That is wrong. They can, but it takes a while for them to get used to it in new situations. The whole point of human beings is that they learn, they grow, they develop over time. So you start off with your natural strengths, the things you can get to grips with very quickly. But then you start to learn things which are not your natural strengths. You have to practice, you have to work hard at them. This is the other side, you could say. If you are a thinker, the other side is feeling. Now, to work out if you're a feeler, you flip it around. So a feeler should be someone who is able to very capably orientate themselves in new personal, subjective information, judgments in this area, how they feel towards others, orientating themselves in a new social environment, the mood, whatever that is. They should be able to orientate themselves very well, confidently in this area. Meanwhile, feelers will, in an unfamiliar situation, experience more difficulty when it comes to thinking. So, whether that is, again, knowing how to best apply factual information in the most useful and productive way, how to quickly find the solution which works best, how to pick out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense in a certain ideology or argument or structure, and to quickly systemize that and make sense of that when new information is coming in. Feelers are going to struggle with that in unfamiliar situations. But again, if they build familiarity, they should be all right. If a feeler is used to a certain field, let's say they have become a medical doctor and they're well practiced in their zone of expertise, there's no reason why they can't do all the thinking things that a thinker can. It's just that when something completely new comes along and they find themselves out of their depth, well, that's because the area of thinking which is being challenged there is unfamiliar to them. They haven't built their zone of familiarity that far. And vice versa, you'll find that some thinkers can be very sort of likable, charismatic, sincere people who can build and maintain good relationships, perhaps, except that in certain situations, suddenly they find that that style of coming across no longer comes across sincerely or well, or is misjudged to the situation. That sort of thing, which should happen when they're in an unfamiliar situation. So that is what I would say is the key difference between a feeler and a thinker. This inability to adapt to unfamiliar situations that play on that particular part of either thinking or feeling. And if they can adapt, if it's in the thinking zone, they are a thinker. If they can adapt, if it's in the feeling zone, they are a feeler. Now, what I would also say is this: there should be some aspects, depending on whether you're extroverted in thinking or introverted in thinking, extroverted in feeling, introverted in feeling. So there'll be some aspects which you probably won't be able to as readily learn and acquire that zone of familiarity in. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you are an extroverted thinker, right? And I say extroverted thinker, I don't mean necessarily an extroverted thinking dom or leading type. I mean a type who is extroverted and is also thinking in purely Jungian dichotomy terms, right? So that could be an ENTP, it could be an ESTJ, whatever. Now, if you're someone like that, then you would expect that while you can build up a zone of familiarity in extroverted feeling spaces, you can be quite charismatic. When you are used to this environment, you found certain ways of coming across which work to mobilize a room, which come across well. You may find that introverted feeling, so matters to do with your close personal relationships, managing intimacy and closeness with each individual person and knowing confidently how close you should get to each person and maintaining that should be far more difficult, and you'll be far less able to build your zone of familiarity in that zone. It might be, if it's not even valued, a complete zone of blindness, say an ENTP. Now, similarly, if you are an introverted and thinking type, right, you should be able to build a zone of familiarity over time with familiar sorts of relationships with people and know how to maintain those relatively well. But you'll be far less able to build that zone of familiarity over time in an extroverted feeling situation where you have to come across convincingly to a group of people. You have to address a crowd. You have to be convincing and persuasive in an emotionally galvanizing way, and be confident that what you say will actually be responded to positively by everyone around you. That is going to be less accessible to an introverted and thinking type. That's why they tend to be called quite, as it were, sort of cold-blooded or dispassionate types, you could say. They're not actually cold-blooded, as they don't easily convey their emotional states in a way which becomes infectious to others. And similarly, the extroverted and thinking types, often called the business-like types, because they're very good at relaying high quantities of factual information, but they're not so good at actually building closeness and intimacy in a sort of more deeply personal way. So yes, you could either come across a bit too impersonal, but still rather engaging if you're extroverted in thinking, or you could come across very personably and sincerely, but not charismatically and engagingly, which is more like to be an introverted and thinking type. Okay, so those are the thinkers. For the feelers, same sort of thing applies. So if you're extroverted and feeling, right, then you could, of course, adapt to the extroverted thinking aspects. So you're more likely to be able to make more pragmatic decisions, learn how to do things effectively and efficiently. Like you'll find that an ENFJ, for instance, or an ENFP could probably fit into a CEO role where you have to manage all sorts of complex processes under you, they probably fit in that rather well because they can sort of adapt enough within a zone of familiarity to those pragmatic pressing demands, and taking in a larger amount of factual information to apply. Now, where they'll struggle, though, is with introverted thinking. So tying that together consistently, formulating clear, coherent rules and principles under which they should act in their tendency to actually engage with many different kinds of people and to be charismatic in that way, they lack that sense of consistency. They become something for everyone and therefore lose that coherent sense of what it is all about structurally and principally. So yeah, they may become a bit incoherent. You find people very, very engaging, very passionate, and you feel really excited by talking to them, but actually what they say is a bit of waffle. not say waffle, but it doesn't make coherent sense. It contradicts itself. That's kind of a sign of someone who's extroverted and feeling. And then you get to someone who is introverted and feeling. Now, yeah, these types can actually do the structural side. They can look at the ideas and they can see what makes sense, what doesn't make sense within their zone of familiarity. They can develop an expertise in a certain field where they understand what makes sense, how things fit together, and they can form structures to better understand new information. But where they'll struggle is in grappling with a large amount of factual data and applying it efficiently and productively, and updating how they're thinking to do things as effectively and pragmatically as possible. They may struggle to know what data is relevant, how to actually build that logical coherence out of all this data. So you may find an extreme example such as, types which are TI, say mobilizing or tertiary. So the INFP, the ISFP. So that is types with NI and SI at the top, then FE. They'll lack extroverted thinking entirely. They'll be their blind spot. So they may greatly struggle to actually change their mind with new facts. They'll stick to the structure without any sense of the facts. Or if you take, say, INFJs, ISFJs, those with FI at the top, they kind of want to outsource to someone else to provide the factual knowledge and expertise across a range of different areas, be up to date with current events and update the information. They're more to stick to their field and try to do that as well as they can, and that confidence in that may feel they're never quite as competent as other people, and they may lean on their relationships to have that factual information being provided. So, as I said, this is where it's complicated. This is where I say, similar to sensing intuition, you can't just look at thinking and feeling, really. It's more useful to dive into, are they extroverted and feeling? Are they introverted and feeling, etc., to really pick out, therefore, where the deficits are. If they're introverted and feeling, they're going to have an extroverted thinking deficit. If they are extroverted and thinking, they're going to have an introverted and feeling deficit. That's, I would say, is far more useful for typing. So, yeah. Now that I've talked about this sort of correct understanding of feeling versus thinking, I want to dive into where I think the Myers-Briggs type indicator gets it very wrong. And this is the notion that if you are a thinker, you are going to be tough-minded. And that if you are a feeler, you're going to be warm-hearted. And this general desire to tie feeling and thinking to what is essentially the trait of agreeableness in the Big Five. So I think it's completely wrong. There's no basis for it whatsoever in thinking about feeling versus thinking, what feeling is about. Feeling is about feeling emotions, right? Sure, that can make you more passionate, right? But it doesn't mean you would be any less tough, even if you are naturally attuned to the emotions and feelings and perspectives of everyone around you. And similarly, if you are a thinking type, yes, that makes you more able and more comfortable in detached information, stuff which is separated from the emotions, right? But that tells you nothing about how tough the person is. It tells you nothing about whether they'll actually make very hard decisions and push them through against other people. And this is the point, really. Toughness it's not sufficient to be logical, to be tough. You can be someone who's very analytical and can pick out exactly what makes sense in principle. And you may think that all you need to do, therefore, is to reason with people, and people will agree with you, and then get, ignored, and then perhaps punched in the face, and then go cry and hide away for years at a time, because that doesn't work. Some of the most fragile people could actually be logical types. And I would even say that there's some logical types who, because they lack confidence in feeling, especially extroverted feeling. I'm speaking more of, say, the INTJs. I mean, TI up at the top, in the correct understanding, not the incorrect Myers-Briggs understanding, right? So TI and NE. This is the type which is often so insecure about extroverted feeling because it's not strong, but it's still valued, that actually they fear negative reactions in people so much they don't even go out and engage enough. They may hide away. They may have avoidant personality characteristics. So you cannot call someone like this tough-minded. It makes absolutely no sense to call them tough-minded. The toughness, right? Toughness itself is not about detachedness. Toughness is about going out and confronting things and being resilient against it and eventually pushing through. A tough person can weather things. Even if they feel them, they can still weather them. Being desensitized from the interpersonal sphere does not necessarily make you tough. In fact, if you are desensitized, but you also are worried about it because you're desensitized, you're worried about the effects of it, even though you can't pick up on it enough to actually navigate it, that can actually make you a very vulnerable character. Hence, as I described about the INTJ, TI and E, I mean. So that doesn't work. So in the same way, right, you could take an ESFP. Now, an ESFP leads with extroverted sensing. Now, if you've been listening to my other videos of Jungian type explained correctly, I talk about extroverted sensing as being very much about toughness, because it is that primal, dominating physicality and volitionality on the physical real world to push out, to have an impact. So the ESFP is very tough. They will go in there and they will get what they want. They're quick thinking, they are proactive, they are engaging, they are assertive. But they're also feelers. So this is a type which will be very aware of their personal relationships with each person, aware of the mood, the environment around them, and will know how to manage their relationships with others to get what they want. That is very tough. That is what we may call the iron fist in the velvet glove. And unfortunately, if you think of feeling and thinking in terms of tough-minded versus warm-hearted, you can't actually have a logically coherent conception of the iron fist in the velvet glove. And it is such an important aspect of understanding certain personality types. So no, don't do that. Don't tie up thinking to tough-mindedness and feeling to warm-heartedness. It doesn't work. Instead, think of it in terms of, first of all, strength. First and foremost, the ability to confidently interpret this kind of information and navigate it, right? That's nothing to do with how affected you are by it. Again, you can be an INTJ and you can be greatly susceptible to other people's attempts to sway you emotionally, but have no ability to actually motivate people back and navigate that yourselves. It makes you a lame duck in this area, right? By being a lame duck, you are susceptible to it, but you cannot manage it. You have no strength in this area, but it still affects you. So thinking feeling cannot deal with those kinds of nuances. This is where you need other function dichotomies to really break down what is going on. Strong versus weak is one area. You can talk about how stubborn someone is in something versus flexible is something, if they value it or they don't value it. There's more complexity under the hood here, which you're not going to get from a regular Myers-Briggs understanding because it's so simplistic. So, yeah, I'd say that the INTJ and the ESFP are the clearest examples of where you have a thinking type that is really not tough, actually quite delicate, can be quite fragile in a sort of a socially oriented space. That is also a type which, because of them valuing introverted sensing rather than extroverted sensing, which is actually their blind spot, they are especially averse to toughness in terms of I'm right because I am mighty. I'm going to force through what I want. No, this is a type that's going to try and reason with everyone and is not necessarily going to persuade and is not necessarily going to get what they want and can't really try to get what they want unless they have a clear reason for it, because it comes all from their principles. And an ESFP can be bloody tough, and they are not a type which is thinking or logical. They're not. They grow in their zone of familiarity with extroverted thinking. They can become very pragmatic, very achievement-oriented people, but they will lack structure. They will lack coherence and consistency in what they're doing. They won't understand why the rules are there. They'll mix and match them. They can bastardize them, etc., because they don't understand why that thing fits together on a theoretical level. So they're not thinkers. They can't grasp that kind of thinking, but they are still very tough-minded. So yeah, that's what I would say to this matter. And some real life examples, just to give you a clue. There are some examples of really tough feeling types who are typed as thinkers because Myers-Briggs has no conception of a tough feeler. So, perfect example, Margaret Thatcher. Right? Remember Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom back in the 80s? She is commonly typed an ESTJ because people cannot conceptualize a feeler who is tough. She was very tough. She was the Iron Lady, but she did not have confidence in extroverted thinking. She was very, she was quite conservative, not conservative in terms of political. She was conservative politically as well, but she was conservative in how far to embrace a neoliberal agenda. She eventually did, but only because of her advisors, and she tried it very gently and carefully, and when it started to seem right, then she went more into it. But then she didn't know when to actually stop in what she was doing with, say, the poll tax and other problems. She relied a lot on her advisors, people who were very factually competent around her. She lent on them a lot. She valued their knowledge and expertise. She was happy not being the smartest person in the room in terms of the factual applicability of things. She was, what her gift was really, was first of all strength of will. When she decided on something, she went on it and she did not brook any opposition. She was very single-minded once she had decided on something. That is because she had very good sensation, extroverted sensation, and she had a good understanding of detail supporting that introverted sensation. She had a tendency towards that single-mindedness because her introverted intuition was her mobilizing function, a tertiary function, and she had no extroverted intuition, so she struggled with alternative perspectives. But she, in terms of her ability for making judgments, they were personal judgments. She was about her relationships with others, who she could trust, who she couldn't trust. She saw everything in terms of the personal. That person as a bad, weak character. That person is someone I can trust. I can get to know them. I like them as a person. She liked Reagan. She even liked Gorbachev. She did not like some of the other Europeans, and she didn't like those in Labour. She got to know them as individuals, and she formed her judgment accordingly. That was her ability to know who to trust in and who not to trust in terms of forming her cabinet, in terms of bringing the people close to her. That was it. And she was very quick to make those judgments and very confident and rarely changed them once she made her mind in that area. So ethics, introverted ethics specifically, was her main focusing point. There's one other thing I should say around this area. If you have, say, a kind of feeling as a leading function or a kind of thinking as a leading function, you may appear to be weak in the inverse. And you might not actually be weak in the inverse, you might just appear to be that way. So if you take, say, a Margaret Thatcher's example, she was very conviction-led. Her personal attitudes towards character, what makes a good person, a bad person, etc., shaped everything. And she would do what was sincere to her at the expense of what was perceived to be popular. Very strong value of hers. Do not do what's popular. If you're not being hated, you're actually not doing anything worthwhile. But people say, well, that must be a thinker. No, she could be as charismatic as she wanted to, but She only did that where it was in line with her very personal, sentiment-driven relationship forming. So that is a strength, her extroverted feeling, but not a valued strength. It was unvalued. It's what we call the ignoring function. If you go back to explain correctly the functions, the ignoring function is that which looks weak but isn't, because you suppress it until your leading function or dominant function calls upon it. So when thinking about this, you'll find that if someone is thinking or feeling dominant, that what the inverse of what they're dominant in will be that ignoring function. So that will look weak, but it isn't. So you need to keep that in mind as well when you're typing people. So yeah. So strength is specifically what someone can do. It's not what someone necessarily will do, because they may decide not to, even though they can do. Again, another area of complexity when it comes to typing. Why just looking at, you think or a feeler is, you have to be very confident you've identified both uses of something to know that they are definitely that and not the other one, or very confident they have none of one kind and they definitely cannot use it rather than just choose not to use it. So I hope that was helpful for understanding thinking versus feeling. Other examples that come to mind, people often typed Adolf Hitler as an ENTJ. He's not an ENTJ. There's no thinking. He wasn't about thinking. He was masterful at extroverted feeling, which doesn't have to be warm and cuddly. It can be warm and cuddly when it's put with introverted sensing. But if you take an ENFJ, introverted sensing is out of the picture. They actually instead try to push extroverted sensing, which is tough and assertive again. So yeah, there's no reason the ENFJ needs to be cuddly and sweet and nice. They don't. And they can be, as long as they have that ability to affect people emotionally, ENFJs can be potentially quite sinister and quite very tough people. Well, say tough with Hitler was sort of, it varied depending on his zone of familiarity. If he was outside his zone of familiarity, actually wasn't so tough. He wasn't so tough up next to Stalin, for instance. He couldn't quite manage at that level. But yeah, so what I would say to this is, you think of someone like an Elizabeth Holmes or Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is a better example because he wasn't, he's not a uniformly understood to be bad sort of person. He wasn't. He had flaws, of course, but he was also a greatly admired character. People type it must be an ENTP or something. No. Or an ISTP. No, he was an ENFJ because he was charismatic, because he understood more than the logic. He understood the feelings and how to get people excited about a product. He was a genius in terms of extroverted feeling, how to tap into people's emotional states. So that's the last thing I finish off there with, understanding of thinking versus feeling. I hope that was helpful. And yes, if you see anyone saying someone must be a thinker because they're too tough to be a feeler, say that they are absolutely wrong. Very important. Call them out. Make them feel bad about themselves for using silly arguments. All right. Everyone, thank you very much. Speak soon.